My name is Opal Hendricks. I'm 64 years old. Last April, my daughter listed my house for sale without telling me. Not a phone call, not a text. A lockbox appeared on my front door on a Thursday morning while I was at the grocery store, and when I came home to find it hanging off my door handle like it owned the place, I had to phone the real estate office myself to ask what it was for. My neighbor across the street watched me stand on my own porch with a bag of groceries and a look on my face. She later described, very generously, as confused. She was being kind. I knew exactly what it was. I just wasn't ready to know it yet. I have lived at 4 Hawthorne Crescent in Burlington, Ontario for 35 years. My husband, Howard, and I bought it in the fall of 1989 for $178,000, which was every dollar we had and then some. Howard was an electrician with the city. I worked at a law firm in downtown Hamilton. The mortgage officer at our bank told us we were stretching. She was right. That first winter, we kept the thermostat at 16 degrees and wore sweaters to dinner like it was a policy. Howard's parents thought we were impractical. We thought we were brave. Howard died on the 17th of March, 2022. He was 63 years old. Heart attack. He was in his workshop in the garage on a Tuesday morning, repairing a lamp for the neighbor at the corner, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was already over. I went into the workshop weeks later, finally. The lamp was still on his workbench. I plugged it in. It worked. That detail has never stopped being funny and terrible in equal parts. In the spring of 1990, the first spring we were here, Howard planted a lilac bush along the back fence. He put it too close to the fence posts. I told him so. He said it would be fine, and then the bush grew into the fence anyway, wound itself around 2 posts in a way that made it impossible to move without losing half of it. And by the time we understood the problem, we'd decided we didn't mind. Every May it blooms. Deep purple, crowded, slightly bent from fighting the fence for 3.5 decades, completely indifferent to the poor conditions it was put in. That bush bloomed the May after Howard died, and I sat beside it for an hour and didn't know what to do with that fact. It has outlived him, and it doesn't seem to know. People ask what I did before I retired, and I usually say I worked at a law firm in Hamilton. That's true. What I leave out is the specific kind of work. Because as soon as you say real estate law, people either lose interest or start telling you about their own closing. And either way, you've lost the next 10 minutes of your life. I was a legal secretary and then a paralegal at Broadfield and Associates on James Street North for 31 years. I processed title searches. I drafted transfer documents. I registered instruments at the land titles office when the lawyers were too busy, and I wasn't. I read every page of every deed that came across my desk because that was the job, and because if I didn't, no one else would catch it in time. I retired in June of 2021. The firm gave me a card signed by everyone and a bottle of Ontario ice wine. I kept the letter opener. Remember that. It becomes important, not for the reason you think. My daughter came over on a Saturday in April with a folder and a plan she'd already finished building. She's 41. She has her father's patience and her grandmother's jaw. And she developed, somewhere in her 30s, a habit of turning things into logistics so she doesn't have to feel them. She set a glossy brochure on my kitchen table. Parkside Gardens Retirement Living, it said. A photograph of a woman with a silver chignon laughing at a cup of tea in a sunlit common room. She slid it 2 inches toward me. She and her husband had been talking, she said, about the house, about whether it still made sense for one person. Her husband didn't come that day. He's 43. He has a quality I've spent years trying to name, a kind of efficient goodwill toward other people's problems that stops just short of asking them how they actually feel. He's not a bad man. He's practical, which is its own kind of trouble. I put the kettle on. I asked my daughter a question I already knew the answer to. Who did you speak to before you spoke to me? She looked at the brochure. Then she said there was someone, an agent, Clifton. He specializes in what she called senior transitions. He'd run some numbers. That phrase. She said the Burlington market was still strong. She said if we waited, we'd be leaving money on the table. We. That pronoun. I let it go and asked the next question. "And where do I go?" I said. "Well, we're not leaving money on the table." She tapped the brochure. "You'll be comfortable there, Mum. There are activities. There are people your age. You'll have support." 7 words spread over 4 sentences, and not one of them landed in the same room I was standing in. She still hadn't looked up from the cover photograph. I want to be fair to her, because the truth is more complicated than the easy version. She and her husband opened a specialty food shop in Oakville in 2019. Beautiful store, charcuterie counter, local preserves, imported cheese, the kind of place that would have found its footing in a kinder decade. COVID hit in March of 2020, and they never fully recovered the revenue. They took out a $115,000 business loan, at a rate that made Carmen wince when I mentioned it later. They also have a line of credit on their own house in Oakville. Between the 2 obligations, they are somewhere around $180,000 in the red, and they have been for over 2 years. I know this because my son-in-law told me in October of 2022, over lunch, alone at my kitchen table, in a conversation that began as checking in and ended as a proposal. "There was equity sitting in the house," he said, "more than I needed. The market had appreciated significantly. Had I thought about what I might want to do with it?" I said yes, I'd thought about it. I was going to live here. He smiled and said, of course. He just meant, had I considered the options? A home equity line of credit, for instance. He'd found a product at one of the big banks. He'd looked into it. I said no. I said it clearly and once. Then I asked if he wanted more coffee. He said no. He left not long after. 6 weeks later, I received a letter from the bank, addressed to me, informing me that my application for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $80,000 had been declined due to income verification requirements for applicants over 60, acting under power of attorney. I had not applied for anything. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time. Then I called Carmen Aldridge. She's been practicing in Hamilton for nearly 30 years. She bills in 6-minute increments and she doesn't waste them. I told her what the letter said. She asked if there was a continuing power of attorney for property currently in effect. I said yes. I'd signed one in the spring of 2020 before my hip replacement surgery, naming my daughter as my attorney. Carmen had drafted it herself. She went quiet for a moment and then she said, "We should take care of this today." I revoked the power of attorney that same afternoon. Carmen prepared the revocation documents. The following morning, we registered it at the Ontario Land Titles Office through TerraNet, the province's electronic land registry system. Document number ON 2022-114872. Registered August 14, 2022 at 9:04 in the morning. It became a registered instrument against the property. A public record. Anyone searching that address would find it. Carmen mailed a copy to my daughter by registered mail, return receipt requested. The green card came back 10 days later. The signature in the delivery box was not my daughter's. I know her handwriting. She still writes in the looping cursive her grade 4 teacher taught her. The signature on the card was flat and forward-leaning. It was my son-in-law's. I put the card in an envelope in the filing cabinet in the den. Then I went outside and stood by Howard's lilac for a while, because I needed to be somewhere he had been. I did not tell my daughter what I had done. Not in 2022, not in 2023, not when she called it Christmas, not when we had dinner in February and talked around the things we were both not saying. She never mentioned the bank letter. She never asked about the power of attorney. She filed the whole episode somewhere and moved forward. That silence was its own kind of answer. Now let me tell you about the spring and everything I let happen and the reason. The lockbox went on my door that Thursday morning in late April. When I called the real estate office from my driveway, the woman who answered was pleasant and efficient and told me the property was listed under the continuing power of attorney held by my daughter. She did not ask whether I was the person who actually lived there. Clifton came by that afternoon. Good shoes, easy handshake, the practiced warmth of a man who has given the same speech many times and believes most of it. He called me Mrs. Hendricks, which no one has used since Howard's funeral. He asked to walk the property, which is the phrase agents use when they mean your house. I let him in. I want you to notice that I let him in. He told me the roof would need replacing within 5 years. We replaced it in 2018. I didn't correct him. I wanted to know what else he was certain of that he hadn't checked. At the door on his way out, I asked him one direct question. I asked whether he understood that I lived here. He gave me a look I've seen before on well-meaning men. Not unkind, just slightly ahead of you in a hallway they're already halfway down. Of course, he said. But the family makes these decisions, Mrs. Hendricks. I've been through it many times. Then he told me about his own mother, a bungalow in Stony Creek he'd sold after her stroke in 2019. He said it was the kindest thing he'd done for her. He said it twice. He believed it. That's what turned my stomach. He wasn't running a scheme. He had built his entire professional identity on the sincere conviction that families decide and owners are seen to afterward. He had the old power of attorney in his folder. He had never thought to search the registry. He signed the listing agreement in my daughter's name that same week. As attorney, in fact, using a document that had been legally revoked and publicly registered for nearly 2 years. Welcome to Fierce Mom Stories. I'm Opal. Drop a comment below and subscribe if you're staying, because what happens at the end is the whole reason I'm telling this. Here's why I didn't do anything about it in April, or May, or the first 3 weeks of June. There are 2 reasons, and I'll give you the practical one first. A friend of mine, I'll call her my friend from work, because she deserves that privacy, went through something similar 2 years ago. Her son decided she was no longer competent to manage her own finances. They argued about it in her kitchen on a Sunday. She raised her voice. She said things that were true and entirely reasonable at a volume that matched the situation. 6 weeks later, her son filed for a capacity assessment through the Consent and Capacity Board of Ontario. 2 of the paragraphs in the supporting paperwork described her as emotionally dysregulated and resistant to appropriate support. She spent more than $25,000 fighting it. She won. She kept her accounts and her independence. She also stopped having people over, stopped picking up the phone after 7 in the evening, and something in her went quiet that has not come back. When my daughter set the Parkside Gardens brochure on my table in April, I called Carmen Aldridge that same afternoon. I told her everything. She said something I've repeated to myself close to 200 times since. Opal, if you fight this in your kitchen, you lose. Not because you're wrong, because the kitchen is their room. Anything you say or do there becomes a description of your mental state. You need to wait for a room where only the paper matters. I said I knew exactly which room. She said she thought I might. The second reason is the one I'd rather not say out loud, but I'm going to, because someone listening to this needs to hear it and not the polished version. I was waiting for my daughter to stop on her own. Every morning of those 78 days, I woke up and thought, today is the day. She pulls up to the house and comes up the front steps and says, Mom, I overstepped. That's all it would have taken. Not a long conversation, not an apology with footnotes. 1 sentence at my door, and I'd have put the kettle on, and we would never have spoken of it again for the rest of our lives. That's why I let strangers walk through my kitchen all spring. It wasn't strategy. I hadn't finished hoping yet. There was a third thing, colder. Carmen told me that if I called the appropriate provincial services in April with nothing but a lockbox and a feeling, the resulting file would close with a note that read, Family making appropriate arrangements, no irregularities identified. A closed file with my name on it is worse than no file. For any of this to carry weight, there had to be conduct, documented, dated, signed, and registered. And my son-in-law had handed me all of it. He mailed it, couriered it, and copied me on it the way you CC a tenant. He was so certain of what he had that he never once thought to check what I had registered 2 years before he started. My granddaughter found out in May. She's 24. Nursing student at McMaster in Hamilton, works shifts at a medical clinic on weekends, and she is the only person in my family who has ever asked me a question and then sat quietly until I finished answering it. She texted me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her mother had shared the listing in their family group chat. Exciting changes for Grandma, it said. 3 heart emojis. She showed up at my door 45 minutes later in her scrubs with 2 coffees from the Tim Hortons on New Street. She stood on my porch staring at the lockbox. She said, "It looks like a car boot on your house, Grandma." Then she sat down on the front steps and cried, which I was entirely unprepared for. She said she'd called her dad and been told to stay out of it. She said she'd show up at the closing and make a scene. She said she'd film the whole thing. I told her no. I told her if she made a scene, this became a story about a family in conflict, and every person in that room would choose the version that's easiest to believe about a 64-year-old widow. She looked at me for a long moment, the way young people rarely look at anyone, very steady. Then she said, "Okay, but I'm bringing coffee every week until this is done." She did. Every Tuesday. She never once discussed me with someone else while I was standing 4 feet away. She doesn't know what that has meant to me. I'm not sure how to tell her. My neighbor across the street brought a tuna casserole in late May, foil on top. The universal Canadian language, for I've heard something and I don't know what to say, so here is food. She held my arms at the door and looked at my face carefully. "Just say the word, honey," she said, "if it's getting to be too much." Then she said, "My daughter was being so good about everything." She said it with visible relief, because the good version was easier to stand next to. By the end of May, on my own street, in the house I bought in 1989, I had become a situation being managed, and I want you to sit in that for a moment, because that was the part that actually hurt. Not the sale, the pronoun. The way everyone around me had a we around my house, and I was somewhere inside the we, being organized. The open house was on a Saturday morning in early June. Clifton texted me the night before suggesting I find somewhere else to be. So I put on lipstick, walked across the street, and sat on my neighbor's porch with 2 glasses of iced tea and counted cars. 22. A couple in their 30s stood in my driveway discussing the eavesdrows. A man in a Toronto Maple Leafs cap opened my mailbox for no reason at all. 2 women came out of my house talking about the kitchen. One of them said the whole place would need to be updated top to bottom, and the other one agreed in a tone that meant old. Howard's lilac had just finished blooming. There were purple petals on the grass under the fence. My neighbor reached over without a word and put her hand on my arm. I went to the Service Ontario location on Brant Street on a Tuesday morning in the middle of June. Used the public terminal. Searched the property records for 4 Hawthorne Crescent through Teheranet, Ontario's electronic land registry. A basic title search costs $3. I brought cash. I already knew what was there. I wasn't discovering anything. I was confirming the sequence before I let it run. The record showed the original deed from 1989, the refinance in 2003, Howard's name removed from the title after his death, registered 2022. And then, right where I had put it, document number on 2022-14872, revocation of continuing power of attorney for property. Registered August 14, 2022 at 9:04 in the morning. Indexed under my name and under my daughter's. Searchable by anyone with $3 and a parking space. No one in this transaction had searched it. Not my son-in-law, not Clifton, not the brokerage. I printed a certified copy for $8. The clerk at the counter stamped it with a raised seal. I folded it in thirds and put it in my bag with the registered mail receipt. Then I drove home the long way, past the church where Howard and I went to the Christmas bazaar every November, past the Tim Hortons on Guelph Line, where he once spent 15 minutes teaching a teenager how to use a level. He was very patient with young people. He thought it was the most underrated quality a person could have. I will tell you about the second document in a moment. There was a second registered instrument. I'll get there. The order matters. My daughter came by alone on the 24th of June. Early evening, no notice. She sat on the front steps beside the raised garden bed Howard built the last summer he was well. She looked at the lilac along the back fence, overgrown now, fully green in the July, way it gets once the blooming is done. "He planted that wrong," she said. "He knew," I said. "He always meant to move it." She rubbed her thumb along the fence post where the branches had grown into the wood. Her hands were tired. She has had her father's hands since she was about 12 years old. Then she stood up. "Mom," she said, "don't make this into more than it needs to be." I asked her what it was then. She said it was practical. She said I'd be settled by September and wonder what I'd been worried about. She said she'd handle the details. I said I hadn't asked anyone to handle anything. She said, "No, you haven't," and she said it in a way that turned my silence into a permission I had never given. Then she drove away. That was the last door. She had her hand near it and she walked past it. I watched her reverse down the driveway and turn onto the street. And I went inside and stood in the kitchen and thought about all the years before this spring and how easy they'd been. And how little either of us had understood that the ease was something we were both choosing every day. The call I'd been waiting for came on a Monday morning at the end of June. A paralegal named Amara from the buyer's law firm in Burlington. Pleasant, professional, slightly apologetic about the timing. Her firm represented the young couple buying the house. As part of their standard due diligence, she said, and given that recent instruments appeared in the title search, they required the registered owner to appear in person at closing and sign directly. She confirmed the date, first week of July. She asked me to bring photo identification. My daughter called 40 minutes later. She said it was routine. A few signatures. It would take 15 minutes, she said. 15 minutes. She had reduced the last legal act of my life in this house to 15 minutes and a formality. That evening, I took my navy blouse out of the closet and ironed it, which I had not done since Howard's funeral. I laid out my good shoes. I put my license in the outside pocket of my bag so I wouldn't be searching for it at a table full of people. If you have ever ironed a blouse for a room where someone expects you to be furniture, you know exactly what you're doing at that ironing board. You're telling yourself something you can't say out loud yet. The night before the closing, I called Carmen at home, which she permits twice per client, and I had used neither. I told her Amara's firm had required me in person. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You understand what's happening in the morning?" I said yes. They'll run a final title search before registration. In Ontario, the lawyers check the full chain of title right up to the morning of closing. Anything registered against the property, new liens, new instruments, anything shows up. Carmen said yes, and the revocation from 2022 is still registered. I said no one had asked me to clear it. No one had called me about it at all. She said, "Do you want me in that room?" I said no. If Carmen walks into that office, this becomes Opal Hendricks making a legal maneuver. If I walk in alone with my license and my bag, it's just a woman sitting at a table while a lawyer does her job. The record doesn't need an advocate. That's the entire point of a record. Carmen said, "Don't help them. They'll get there." I put 2 certified copies in my bag, the revocation and the second document, which I'll tell you about properly now because we're nearly there and the order is finished. In late 2022, a few months after Howard died, I went back to Carmen for something separate. I wasn't sure about a lot of things in those months. Whether to stay in Burlington, what the winter would feel like, how much of the house still needed to be the house it had been. But I was sure about one thing. I did not want to be one conversation away from someone else's pen on my title. Carmen suggested I file a declaration of sole ownership, a registered instrument confirming that I was the sole owner of 4 Hawthorne Crescent, acting independently and in full legal capacity, and that any dealing with the property required my direct participation and signature. Not unusual after the death of a spouse. We filed it the same week as the revocation. It went into the registry on the same morning, indexed under my name. Document number ON 2022-114891. Registered August 14, 2022 at 9:06 in the morning, 2 minutes after the revocation. Both of them sat in the public record for almost 2 years. The closing was at a law office on Lakeshore Road, second floor, above a dry cleaner, with a long boardroom table and a box of tissues in the center because they know. I arrived 8 minutes early and sat at the far end. The buyers came in first. Late 20s, first house, nervous in the way people are nervous at a wedding. Not afraid exactly, just aware that something permanent is about to happen. The woman had a folder with a photograph of their golden retriever clipped to the front. Their lawyer Amara came in after, efficient reading glasses on a chain, a document binder, and a laptop. Clifton arrived with 2 pens. My son-in-law came in on his phone, my daughter behind him. My daughter looked at me the way you look at something that's not quite where you left it. Amara opened her laptop. She confirmed identification. She confirmed the property address. Then she paused 1 beat too long, and I watched something small happen on her face. She said, "Before we proceed, I need to flag what we found in this morning's title search." She turned the screen so the table could see it. "Document number ON 2022 1144872, she said. Registered August 14, 2022. This is a revocation of the continuing power of attorney for property that was used to execute the listing agreement. It's been in the Terranet record for just under 2 years. My son-in-law said, "That's not possible." Amara said, "It's a registered instrument with the province of Ontario. Anyone can search it." She said she'd found it at 7 that morning. She said that without a valid power of attorney, the listing agreement signed on behalf of the owner has no legal authority. She said the transaction as structured cannot close. She said she was very sorry about the timing. My son-in-law stood up. He said there must be a mistake. He said the power of attorney was recorded. He said he had a copy in his truck. Amara said having a copy of the original doesn't change a registered revocation. She looked at him carefully and said, "There's also a second instrument. A declaration filed the same morning as the revocation, confirming the owner's sole capacity and requiring her direct signature on any property transaction." She looked at me. The room looked at me. Everyone at that table looked at me at the same time, and I want to be precise about what I did, because it matters. I opened my bag. I took out the Parkside Gardens brochure, which I had carried in my purse since the day my daughter set it on my kitchen table in April. I placed it face up in the middle of the table so the buyers could read the cover. Retirement, living in the heart of Burlington, a woman with a silver chignon laughing at a cup of tea in a sunlit room. My daughter looked at it. My son-in-law looked at it. Neither of them said anything. The sentence they'd been using, "You'll be comfortable there. You'll be fine. You'll have people." They'd said it so many times it had gone smooth, and they'd forgotten where it came from. They hadn't even written their own line. I put both hands flat on the table. I said, "I'm the registered owner. I'm not signing." Amara was still working. That's the thing about people who do a job properly. The emotional weather in a room doesn't change their checklist, she said. I also want to note for the record that I've confirmed with the real estate brokerage that the power of attorney submitted at listing was not verified against the provincial registry prior to the listing agreement being executed. My firm will be noting this in our file. Clifton started to say something about industry practice. Amara said she understood. Then she closed her binder. What came next took about 20 minutes and was mostly logistics. The buyer's mortgage financing could not advance without clear title. Clear title required either my signature or a court order, and neither was available that morning. My son-in-law left without speaking to me. My daughter picked up her coat and her bag and walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, not quite turning around. Then she left. I said goodbye to the buyers. I told them I was sorry. I meant it. They had done nothing wrong. They'd wanted a backyard and a fresh start, and they'd been handed someone else's mess. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before I could get the key in the ignition. Then I drove home. The listing was marked withdrawn from MLS by end of that week. The transaction was terminated that afternoon. It cannot be relisted while I'm living, and the title stands as it is. A fact, not a punishment, just a fact that won't move. I filed a complaint with the Real Estate Council of Ontario regarding Clifton, not for what he didn't catch in the deed, which wasn't strictly his duty, but for accepting a power of attorney instrument without verifying its current status with the provincial registry, and for listing an occupied property without once asking the occupant a direct question. His brokerage removed the Senior Transition Services section from their website within the month. I mailed the buyers a certified check covering their home inspection, their legal fees to that point, and their financing application costs. I included a note that said none of this was their fault. Carmen sent my daughter a letter in July, 2 pages, citing the Substitute Decisions Act and Ontario's definition of financial elder abuse as it applies to unauthorized use of property. It said that any further attempt to act in my name or on my property would be treated accordingly. I changed my locks. I signed a new continuing power of attorney for property naming my granddaughter, with Carmen as alternate. I registered a homestead declaration at the same counter where I'd printed certified copies in June. The clerk recognized me. She didn't say anything. She stamped it and handed it back. My granddaughter moved some of her things into the spare room in August. She's closer to her McMaster placement this way. She leaves for her clinicals at 5:40 in the morning. I hear the door, her boots on the porch steps, and then the house settles back into quiet the way it does when someone young has just left it. I like that sound. It means someone is coming back. Howard's lilac bloomed again this May. It's grown further into the fence now, maybe 3 or 4 of the posts. It blooms anyway, purple, crowded, planted in entirely the wrong spot by a man who meant well and never quite got around to fixing it. I'm not interested in being held up as someone who outmaneuvered anyone. I want to be clear about that, because someone listening to this is already doing the arithmetic on their own house, their own deed, their own name on a title they haven't checked in years. There was no trick. There was a public registry, a $3 search, and a morning at a Service Ontario terminal that took less time than the drive there. Anyone in my family could have looked it up on any Tuesday for 2 years. The record was waiting. No one typed the name. So here's the only thing I know for certain, and I'll keep it to one line because anything longer, and you start decorating it. They can decide what you are in every room, but the one where someone reads the record out loud. Go find out what your record says while you still have the choosing of it. It costs less than a coffee and a muffin. Drop a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.